City University Television presents the American Theater Wing Seminars. Working in the theater. This seminar, playwright, director, choreographer.
Welcome to the American Theater Wing's Working in the Theater Seminars, coming to you from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Now, in their 30th year, these seminars give you the opportunity to learn from the professionals as they share their experiences in working in the theater. Today's seminar is with a panel of playwrights and directors. These are the artists who provide the creative heart of the theater, and it's their work that we will learn about while we discover how the magic of theater is created. I'm Isabel Stevenson, Chairman of the Board of the American Theater Wing. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for this seminar, Jeffrey Eric Jenkins, critic and new editor of the Best Plays series. Would you now take it away, Jeffrey?
Thank you, Isabel. I want to introduce our distinguished group of playwrights and directors to you today. These are the people who create theater works that move us, thrill us, and remind us of our place in the human community. It's a particularly distinguished group that have extensive credits, but I'll be brief in my descriptions today. First, I want to introduce director Gene Saks. He's a three-time Tony Award winner. And he's currently represented off-Broadway by the production of Mr. Goldwyn, a masterly director of comedy. Next is playwright Peter Parnell, who is represented on Broadway by the production of Q.E.D. Peter Parnell. Next is John Guare. John Guare may be familiar to most people as a playwright, but he is also a Tony Award winner as a book writer of Two Gentlemen of Verona. And he is also represented on Broadway now by Sweet Smell of Success, John Guare.
And a play that starts previews tonight.
And a play that starts previews tonight.
Theater.
At Signature Theater.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Guare. To my immediate left is Dan Sullivan. Dan Sullivan is a longtime Broadway veteran and a veteran of the resident theater movement as well. He is currently represented on Broadway for his Tony-winning direction in Proof. Dan Sullivan. Next to Dan Sullivan is Mary Zimmerman. Excuse me. Mary is an adapter and director whose magical work, Metamorphoses, recently won the Lucille Lortel Award. Welcome, Mary Zimmerman. And next to Mary Zimmerman is Jon Robin Baitz. Mr. Baitz is a playwright and adapter who is most recently represented on Broadway by the production of Hedda Gabler that starred Kate Burton. Jon Robin Baitz. Now, I'd like to start today with Mr. Saks. Mr. Saks, I'm wondering, over the years, your craft must have changed in the past, well, shall I say 40 years that it's been, that you've been haunting the boards and directing and acting. Can you share with us how your craft has changed, the collaborative process has changed in that time?
I'm not sure it has. I guess I no longer approve of the double take. I thought that was the greatest thing that ever was. I could do a triple take. After a while, you hurt your neck. But then I saw just, only about 10 years ago how fruitless it was and how it was out of fashion. And you were really, people would scoff at you, even in the street. And so I think the style of comedy has gotten softer, more believable, and less obvious. People seem to be smarter today. They get the joke. You don't have to underline it. And but I'm sure I hadn't thought a lot about the changes, but I think they go along with the changes of people, of life, of fashion, just as clothes do, or anything else we do.
Does it still feel as fresh and new every time? The great British director Tyrone Guthrie used to say that he worried about falling into habits over his long career. Do you still feel, how does it stay fresh for you each time?
You say to yourself, fresh. I don't know. I mean, that's one of the tricks of all acting, whether you call it a trick or not. It's spontaneity. You have to pretend it's the first time you did it, and so you have to rely on new thoughts to do it. Make it urgent for yourself. If the old preparation doesn't work, it gets stale. You have to think up something new. What will get me there with a new thought? I worked with Guthrie. He was wonderful. I'll give you a short story, if you don't mind.
Lovely.
I was in a show in Canada, which we brought to Broadway. I've forgotten the name of it, but he was directing it. And I was playing an English instructor in a Canadian college, and they were having a party, a costume party, and I had a speech that it was very funny. And for the first 2 weeks, Guthrie would laugh at it. He thought it was wonderful. And then he got bored with it. And he started putting the costumes on people. And he had one girl crossing in front of me with an elephant mask. And finally I said, I stopped in the middle of the speech and I said, by this time I called him Tony. I said, Tony, I said, are they going to listen to me? I don't think they're going to be hearing what I say. And he said, quite right. I've been very naughty. He just took the mask. I think he made her go behind me. But that he would get very bored with things he did, and who could blame him? It was boring.
When we're looking at directing and playwriting, what we're also thinking about, I think, is collaboration. That's really that's what theater's all about. It's all about collaboration. And I'm wondering, Jon Robin Baitz, in your work recently, you've been collaborating with Henrik Ibsen, who may be in a room with you. His words are in a room with you. I'm wondering, did you use a literal translation, and then you've adapted, you've perhaps updated a little bit?
Not much updating, really. It's more like gentle house cleaning, and a little one room gets renovated, and but it's Ibsen, you know, and in fact, it was Dan who asked me to do it. Dan was going to direct it in Los Angeles, and many of the translations felt very, very English, felt very British, and they felt like there was a sort of big red curtain, and it was, you know, the old Vic. And it was some very just subtle task or not so subtle task, of clearing away the tone and changing the tone and maybe speeding it up a little bit, and maybe there are a couple less sort of bustles and entrances, and less frogging and ormolu and decoration, and it's more just action. I don't think Ibsen would have. I kept sort of, arguing with myself about what Ibsen would say, and I never heard back from him. So.
Well, that was the question. I was
Dan, I thought, was the sort of Ibsen.
Yes,
figure.
I channeled Ibsen during.
He was like the general in the portrait, the thought, and it had a slightly disapproving look, but I just got used to that.
Well, that's a good place to sort of shift. Dan, what is that process of collaboration? We have on the stage here two of your collaborators. You've collaborated with Jon Robin Baitz. You've collaborated with Peter Parnell. Mm-hmm. What is that process? How does that process work for you as a director? How do you take care of that process?
Well, I've sort of collaborated more with Peter as a producer, really.
Right.
And that process changes from writer to writer, really. Some writers are completely unapproachable, and guidance, if you want to call it that, has to be somewhat more subtle. But I think that you look for people who are like-minded, so that you can speak a common language when you approach any text. Also has to do with the degree of work that has to be done on any given text also. So it's going to change with the personalities that you're working with.
You sort of raise an interesting question, I think, and that is, when it comes to working with new collaborators, certainly there must develop a kind of shorthand when you're working with people you've worked with before. What's it like when you work with a new collaborator? Do you look forward to it? Does that enliven things? Peter, would you address that?
Yeah, I mean, I continually look forward to it because most of the directors I work with won't work with me again, so I have to continually go on to another director. And in the case of Cider House Rules, there were two directors, and Dan was the producer, the original producer, and actually I'm well in touch with both of those directors, and they were working together. And that multiplied for me the difficulties and I guess the joys in some ways of the experience, but that was hard. I think with this was an adaptation of a John Irving book, and there was such an enormous amount of material that we were going through that, and there was this common source material. So the directors were very much hands-on in a good way with me from the beginning. And that was actually refreshing, that I could produce material quickly and then get a very quick response from them about what seemed to be working, what wasn't working, from both the draft stage on into obviously into production.
And when you were working on Cider House Rules, which if folks don't know the work completely, it's a 2-part, 7-hour sweeping epic of adaptation of the John Irving book. When you were working on that, wasn't Irving at the same time developing a film version of it?
Yeah, he had been trying for years and had done a number of drafts of the screenplay and had been working with different film directors on the way too. And the timing actually worked out that we produced our play and got it down from 8 hours down to about 6 hours, first in Seattle at the Seattle Rep, and then in Los Angeles at the Taper, just around the time that John did get the movie finally on. And the play was actually, I thought a beautiful job of scooping out a lot of his own material for the screenplay, but that was actually quite different. And we were going for something that was a little bit more closely applied to the book itself. So he was able to do his adaptation in 2 hours of movie as compared to our 6 hours. But.
And what is that process like? I asked Robbie Baitz about having Ibsen in the room with him. What is that process like when you're thinking about John Irving, and he's still very much with us?
Yeah, the thing was John, by his own, he from the beginning first has great interest in movies, but doesn't particularly, have a great interest in theater, and was a little bit, I think, sort of didn't know what to think of the fact that we felt very passionately about trying to get this book on the stage. And he stayed out of it, and I was, grateful. I mean, he sort of said to me from the beginning, don't, go and do what you're doing. I think once he understood what it was we were trying to do. There was a period after he saw the production, in a very good way, actually, where we had several long conversations about where the production was going in terms of especially the second half of the evening and the problems which he was also facing with his movie. So we had talks about that too, because he sent me the screenplay and wondered what I thought of certain things. It was actually an interesting experience.
Do you think maybe that Cider House Rules, the two-part epic, helped him to solve some of those problems?
They are very different. I think he was able to see. I don't think it. I don't think it really helped him solve. I think one of the things he said to me was that he felt that the humor that was in the book came through very strongly with the use of narrative on stage, and that was something that, good or not, he was going to probably lose a lot of in the movie. And there is a difference in tone there.
Mary Zimmerman, you work in a slightly different way than we often think about developing works. You adapt classic tales, ancient tales, and bring them to the stage with these sort of magical productions. But you work in a slightly, we often think of the authority of the director in the rehearsal hall with the playwright, with the designers, with the actors. And in your case, there's a slightly different focus. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't write anything until I'm in rehearsal. I don't write the act of making the script and the act of directing it are not separate. I write every night or every morning right before going into rehearsal, and there's this base text that the actors are sort of reading if they can, but I'm also sometimes doing texts that are 5,000 or 3,000 pages long, and they're not gonna read them. But I mean, I'm sort of like, I often take really large texts, and in a way my task is to find the structure of just an evening for them. They're often episodic texts, so it's an act of, being cunning in the sort of arrangement of them. And what episodes I tend to choose or be drawn towards often is dependent on who I've already cast. Like, I think this actor that will excel. I can sort of see them doing this, or I have a very strong visual idea of how to do this episode and not such a strong visual idea of how to do this other one. Or in the case of Metamorphoses, there's like 300 tales in Ovid. The ones that sort of make it into the show are the ones that can benefit from the water. It's done in a pool of water that makes sense that way or added to that way. And my strongest collaborator, in a way, aside from the original text, but in the traditional sense of people who are alive that you can have lunch with and stuff, are my designers, because set design works, they have to be building the set even before you're in rehearsal, just that's the physical way it has to happen. And so my designers and I are always looking for a set that's going to be constantly full of surprise and challenge and have character and be defined and yet not confining or overly dictatorial in what's going to happen. And often I find that I'm scripting to exploit the set. I'm scripting to use every trapdoor that we've put in it or every ability to fly. I adapted the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci, actually, and we had floor-to-ceiling wooden file cabinets that could do all kinds of tricks. Like, you could pull on a file cabinet and it would be a stairs that came down. And I had no idea, what we were going to use that for, and that ends up sort of being a guiding principle, rather than the sort of conventional thing, whereas you have the play Hamlet, and you then go and talk to your set designers, and Hamlet requires this, that, and the other, and you look for the actor who's best at Hamlet and the actor who's best at this. It's all kind of like hopefully rising at the same time. Everyone's sort of discovering things sort of at the same moment. My happiest experience with that in collaboration in a way with a set was I also adapted Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust into a piece called 11 Rooms of Proust in a 90,000 square foot warehouse where the audience went from room to room. And we had every rehearsal in the warehouse. And instead of me like staging something pretty and then my lighting designer comes in and lights it in a pretty way, my lighting designer was there every night throwing these strange shadows onto the walls and doing strange effects, and I would stage into those so that hopefully everything kind of fits together. Can I keep talking, or if I talk too
You're
long?
doing great.
In terms of collaborating with the voice of the text, the authors, I feel like I've never sought collaborators, and I know how kind of spooky and this flaky this sounds, but these texts have always sort of found me. And my job is to sort of, I feel like I'm sort of getting out of the way. You know, as much as possible, I'm being unself-conscious, and that's partly why I don't write in advance, and I only have a 3 or 4 week rehearsal period, just like a normal play, because it's too fast for me to calculate. And I don't want to be calculating to make it work. I don't want to be trying to fix it. I just want to be like urgently seeking a way to express what is in this text. It seems like it wants to come out.
Do you think of the actors as collaborators
Absolutely. Although not, definitely in what they can contribute consciously, physically, and in fact, more than one of my adaptations include scenes in them that the actor came up to me, Arabian Nights, someone said, you have to read Aziz and Aziza, and we have to do it. And that became a kind of, that story became a centerpiece of the play. And in other ones, too, they've said, aren't we going to do the, you know, this story, that, because they're reading the text, too. They don't write script, but I colonize them into the play as much as possible. Like, I steal little things I see them doing on breaks, little interactions they have. I exploit, like, for instance, there's a friend of mine who's in a lot of my plays who used to do something for her boyfriend called the naked dance, where she'd do this like little comic dance on the bed. And like I've had her do that in like 4 shows. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, when you're working over and over with the same actors, even if it's an already scripted thing, you say, oh, do the thing that you did that was so good, that was so funny, you know. You pull that in
But
all
Mary,
the
how
time.
much preparation do you do? I mean, you must know a year in advance. I mean, to read
Not
that.
really, and to tell the truth, I mean, I do sometimes, and when I cast the actors, I know the big parts they're playing. Like when I did the Odyssey, I knew Odysseus and I knew Penelope and Telemachus. Beyond that, like who's going to be Cyclops or who's going to be all the sirens or whatever, that's an ensemble, and that all just sort of falls out day to day. I actually only really read the primary text. I don't cloud my head with other people's ideas about it.
I mean, but how far in advance do you read the primary
Well,
text?
to tell the truth, I've actually had shows scheduled because I liked the title, and I hadn't read the book. I pitched a show, Journey to the West, because that title was so beautiful. And I knew one scene from it that my friend Bruce Norris, an actor, had read to me. And that one scene was like, I'm there. Another thing I did called Haft Pakur, I called it Mirror of the Invisible World. It's a 12th century Persian poem. All I knew about it was I ran in the street into an actor named Paul Giamatti, who I bet a bunch of you know. He's a compulsive reader. And he had just come from Colosseum Books, and he was carrying a book called Haft Pakur. And I read the back of it, you know, this Penguin edition, and it said a man has 7 wives, and they live in a castle with 7 domes, each of a different color. And one night a week he goes to each of them and he hears a story in which that color is prominent. And they are alternating tales of requited and unrequited love. And that's all I needed to hear. I mean, that's all I needed to hear. And then I, you know, I take sort of what I want and don't take what I want. I mean, I think it lives in, you know, in my heart in a really strong way. And I have a really kind of familiar relationship with books, you know, a close, you know, I had like a huge crush on Dostoevsky when I was 15, like literally like had sexual fantasy about it. Or not really about Dostoevsky, but like Dmitri, and do I really like Alyosha better or Dmitri, but Dmitri, I mean, you know, I actually had like schoolgirl crushes on literary figures. That's how I've, you know, lived in the world.
Well, it certainly paid off for the theater.
Well, you know, people say to me, like, oh, you do such risky things and such obscure things. I don't know what they're talking about. Like, to me, these texts that have been around for 4,000 years, so what are they talking about that's a risky thing? It's awfully, you know, approved, it seems to me.
What about the water?
What about, like, where'd it come from?
No, I want to know how you get actors to go into the water.
Oh, they love it. You know, they're up for it. And plus, which fact, I first did that show at school, where I'm a school teacher, and the students, you know, if you use young actors who have nothing to lose, they'll do anything. And actually, the method in which I work, oftentimes, I'll tell you a secret, people say to me, that show is so good. If only you had thus and so famous actor in it. If only you had thus and so sophisticated actor in it. And no matter how many times I tell them, the show would not happen with those people in it. They would never, ever agree to do a play without a script in which they didn't know what part they were playing or what it was going to be. Ever. And you can't just then put them in after it's done. It's the spirit of the thing that everyone responds to. I believe this. And sometimes I look at people I've cast and I think like, oh, they're not the most sophisticated or technically perfect, but you know, you respond to a lot of different things in the theater, and the spirit of the thing is one of those primary things. And my actors are really game to get in the water. I mean, you know, they freeze and they this and that, but they...
Oh, darn.
Oh, darn. But, like, tech for that show is a kind of hell. Because they're sitting in it 11 hours a day. And the temperature's dropping.
Do you
and
get it up to a certain what
yes.
level do you get it to when you first start?
It's between, well, it's actually contractual what it's between because it can be a contested thing. But it's like 96 to 102. But you turn off the heat the moment the show starts, so the water temperature starts to drop at that moment.
Does Equity come in with the thermometer?
No, but my stage manager does, absolutely. And, you know, there's pool maintenance, definitely, with the net and everything. Which is handled, by the way, by electrics.
Ah.
And you can figure that out. Electrics handles all things to do with water.
How hilarious.
Almost scary.
Yeah. Set handles the deck, and props handles the pool liner.
Well, they've got it delineated carefully. John Guare, I wanted to ask you about the process. I understand that you do have the show opening at the signature of the play, but I am interested to hear something about the process of a book writer involved with a musical. You know, what is that process like for you over time? You've had a couple of different experiences with Kiss Me Kate being involved with updating Sam and Bella Spewak's work, and then now on The Sweet Smell of Success. What is that process like for a writer?
Well, it's a job. I mean, it's just great because it's just great fun. I mean, when I had written Two Gentlemen of Verona, the book for that by accident 31 years ago, for Joe Papp and Bernie Gersten in Central Park, and it was designed to be written to be played on a truck that went around so like Mary, I knew we had to write something that could be set up, and it was written for that also we
the
were
specific event
the
or specific
event.
place.
If we had done it on in a theater, it would have been a different show, and I don't know a show if I would have been happy with. But because it was written to be done on a truck, and so we wanted certain actors. It was going to play in every neighborhood. We said we want somebody, then we want people in the cast from every neighborhood that we'll be playing in. And luckily we got Raul Julia and Clifton Davis and Carla Pinza, and in the show, we're cutting it down to 90 minutes. If any other Shakespeare play I wouldn't have tackled, but this is a very ramshackle. The structure is very ramshackle, and they're not sure how much of it Shakespeare wrote, but passages of it are just beautiful. And so we had this. Mel Shapiro, the director, had this idea. Brought me into structure because we had just worked on House of Blue Leaves, which had a farce structure, and he wanted me to structure it into a 90-minute event. And then we had this idea of playing out in the streets, noisy street. And it was a summer of great racial unrest and turmoil. That how would people listen to this exquisite poetry? So we got this idea that Galt McDermott, who composed Hair, was going to be the resident composer that year. Again, just fortuitous, he was there, and he was going to write some incidental music for it. So we said, wouldn't it be funny if the songs acted as subtitles before the speech, so that the audience would know what the meaning of the scene was and wouldn't be put off by the poetry and it's being Shakespeare. And so a couple of songs grew into 30 songs, and again by being sparked by the cast, and it was a wonderful time. And then it moved, onto the park and got great reviews, and then moved to Broadway. And the main problem was I had to give it a much more formal opening, and that the greatest problem was writing a formal opening, because you sort of ambled into it in the park. It was light, and then it got dark. This way, the curtain had to go up, and there had to be a very formal opening, and that was the most problem. That was like a nightmare to write the first 20 minutes of the play, and but then we did one day. I mean, it was a nightmare because we couldn't we had all these fancy openings. And I said, I don't know what the problem is. I mean, we just want to show we're doing it. You know, it's just a play by Shakespeare that's nuts. I said, that's right, wait a minute. Jose, and this is a great actor named Jose Perez, was this young kid, and I said, just come out and bow. And the audience had great trouble getting into the play. And I just said to Jose, just come out and say, Two Gentlemen of Verona, a play by William Shakespeare, and hit your head. And he did. And the audience went, yay, and that was it. I mean, it was just, that's what playwriting was, what book writing was. It was just giving the semaphore that let the audience into the world of the play. I did and then I was asked to do a ton of musicals. I won the Tony for that, and was asked to do a lot of musicals. One being, it's still like a dream. I mean, it was to do a musical version. David Merrick asked me to do a musical version of Arsenic and Old Lace with Mary Martin and Ethel Merman, with music by Richard Rodgers. And I luckily said no. I went off to Nantucket and started in the theater. And but I didn't do a musical until a friend of mine, Roger Berlin, had a show called Sophisticated Ladies that was in Washington and going to close. And Roger said, who had produced a play of mine, Lighty Breeze, and said, well, we should come see it. The show is good, but it's just closing. Come down and see it. And I said, I knew how to fix it. I said, I know what to do. And there was another choreographer there. And so we asked Roger, we said, if you close it for 10 days, we promise we'll give you a show. And we made a show up in 10 days. And that's strangely, I think, what musicals are about. Then I had done Kiss Me Kate. I'm not supposed to talk about that because I didn't take any credit on it. This is how we got the rights to it, because it is Sam and Bella Spivak's show, and there were things in it that were just, the show had never been revived in 50 years, and there were things in it that just made no sense. Bernard Baruch jokes. And what makes you laugh? See, maybe we should have kept them in. And there was a long, and Kate had no number in the second act except at the very end. And so it was just wanting to address, as if keeping the show out on the road. And also, again, the director, I'd wanted to work with Michael Blakemore. He was a director I admired tremendously ever since Joe Egg, which was profoundly important to me and a beautiful production. And Michael was directing, and I wanted to work with him. So that was great fun to just, because a play is, a play is one thing, but a musical is like a requisite, a great contraption, and where you have to solve problems immediately, writing in a semaphore style. And one thing I forgot, I had written the book for a musical in 1968 and 86. We did the same show twice, with Jerome Robbins directing, music by Leonard Bernstein, lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. And it was a true nightmare. And talk about a director being bored. Jerry Robbins, we did a workshop in '86 of it, he wanted to go back to it again. And he did 2 scenes that were staggering, that, I mean, directors would build careers on. And he did them, and they worked, and Jerry tossed them out and said, let's start all over again. And so that recklessness of the bored director can be, it can be, it was great, remarkable, it was a nightmare experience, because it was an adaptation of a Brecht play, somebody who defies musicalization. And, but I wanted to work with Jerry, and it was a great experience, a remarkable experience. And then Kathleen Marshall asked me to patch, again, it's patchwork on, for City Center Encores. You've worked. Yes, on Babes in Arms, which is a great show. It's the definitive show about let's put on a play in the barn. And it was amazing that was not much in the play. I mean, it's the memories of the movie are what, so it was just patching that up to make it be what we thought it was, to make the audience's expectations of it to conform to that. And then I was asked to do Sweet Smell of Success, a movie that I love and revere. And the producer then, Garth Drabinsky, of this bankrupt thing called Live End, he was taken away during our first workshop, which was a whole other story, but very freeing. Nothing like having your producer taken away by the police. You're having a nightmare. It was like a fantasy, a playwright's fantasy. They come and get him. Okay, yeah, I'll tell you where to go. But anyway, it's I love that, and I'm very proud of the musical because I think that I felt that why it would be a musical is that the world out of which it comes is the world of Times Square, and it's the dark side of Broadway. It's a very unromantic view of Broadway and the life of of press agents and gossip and columns and the relation to the press and the insidiousness of that. Also, the passions in it was so high that I said this will force singing. And so it was a and I wanted Nick Heitner to direct it because of his work on Twelfth Night with Water and Carousel and not Miss Saigon, but at least he had experience with, he was the director who had the range of work that I admired, from Madness of King George to Carousel to Twelfth Night, and happily Nick came on board. So again, it's always been a wonderful experience. I think that you have to adapting a musical is a much more a joint effort, in a sense like working on a movie. When you're writing a movie, you have to scale back your writing because you just say, well, the camera will take care of this description, the camera will do this, and it'll get too much of a muchness if it's the same way with the composer. You say, I have to write this back because the music will take care of this. But you have to write what the scene will be and write the intention of the song so that the composer, Marvin Hamlish, and the lyricist, Craig Cornelia, will then take from that and write the song out of that, so that hopefully it'll be the link between, the gap between the spoken word and the sung word will just be invisible. And so it was a great experience. It would have been on sooner. We had to wait a year for John Lithgow. Everybody had different commitments, and we just kept, piecing it together.
Did you go back to the novella as well?
Yes, the novellas didn't give anything. Because strangely, the novella and the related short stories are very cozy stories about Sydney and JJ traveling around, going up to Susan's graduation from college, and they're sort of like little anecdotes. And the story of Sweet Smell of Success is it's very close. It's close. Also, what we remember, what I love, and the sense of homage, I must say, in Sweet Smell of Success, was that what we remember is the extraordinary dialogue of Clifford Odets, who apparently was in a van on Broadway that you can still see in some shots, typing out the scenes as they were filming them. And so that's what's missing from the novella. When you read it, is the stories there, but the juice in it is supplied by Odets is not there.
John, what is the role of playwright and director as you move from off-Broadway to Broadway?
I don't understand the question.
Who has a say between the playwright and the director?
Why would there be a difference off-Broadway or on-Broadway?
Well, in the transfer from an off-Broadway, I think what Isabel's asking is about how does that transfer process work from off-Broadway to Broadway? Does the director have any more authority? We were talking about the authority of the director earlier.
But on a musical or a play? I don't understand.
Either one. Does it make any difference?
No. I mean, if you have a rotten experience off-Broadway, you're not going to have a great experience on-Broadway. If that gets to be an issue, it's a play that's not going to transfer.
I guess I might say the one thing you could say to that is it's sort of the director's responsibility if the space is very different. That's kind of his problem or her problem more than the playwright, wouldn't you say? I mean,
but I'll tell you something. I do think that it's because everything that ends up, it's what the Dramatists Guild is about, is protecting that text, and I think that it would be within the playwright's purview to say that if a play that he had written for a 99-seat theater was suddenly going to transfer to the Broadway theater, to the Gershwin, a 2,000-seat theater, that I think you would say, if you're just going to do that to market it, that you would have a right to say, my play will die there, and you can't do it no matter what star has come in. And so I think that the relationship, in musicals, the relationship has always been, I think that the playwright, the director in a musical is the king. Because there are so many more aspects of the theater that have to be addressed, and so you have to have a director that you respect, that you're saying, asking what are the requirements that you want. I think that in a play, I once asked, will all those, yes. And that happened to you in your theater. It was in the Times today about how your performance was disrupted by that very thing.
True.
Yeah.
It wasn't me, though.
But I once asked Lanford Wilson, it was a mess. I was trying, I couldn't find a director to work with. And I asked Lanford, I said, how do you find a director? And Lanford said, very easy. He said, I give them my play, and I ask them to read it, and I ask them to tell me, then I meet with them, and I ask them to tell me the story of my play. And if the story that they tell me vaguely matches up with the story that I think I've written, then I know we can work together. But that's all it is. I mean, it's a good production is one where everybody is involved in telling the same story, and that's a happy production. But I think in a play that it's much more. I do believe as a playwright and as a council member of the Dramatists Guild that the text of a play is the key element in a theatrical production, and everybody is working towards that, including the playwright, towards protecting his own text or honing in on, not changing gears on not rewriting his play out of his intention, or not allowing the director to rewrite his play into another play that the director didn't intend.
In casting, does the playwright or the director work with the casting?
For me, I find that the auditions are the most valuable time, because if it's, I think you decide what the style of the text, what the style of the production is going to be from the auditions, where you say, isn't it interesting that the way that girl, she's not right for the part, but she found a laugh there that it's very interesting, or I like the way that he did that, or I didn't like the way these people, I think, found the traps in the script that we must avoid. That this might be, it can't get too emotional there, or it has to be. You find the style of the play, for me, evolves out of the very collaborative connection between the playwright and the director during the audition process.
I think that's true. I think very often actors that coming into auditions don't understand that. They think that the playwright and the director are sitting there very judgmentally about them, but very often they're discovering the play in that moment.
Well, Dan, when you've had a lot of success recently working with O'Neill in Ah Wilderness and Moon for the Misbegotten, and then Shaw with Major Barbara, and you've had a lot of success as well working with new plays. You're noted for your work with new plays and the development that you did at the Seattle Repertory Theater. How does that process for you as a director, developing a production, how does that differ, other than you can hear the playwright breathing in the room with you?
I think it doesn't differ at all, really. You can't make a lot of changes, when you're working with already excellent work, but depending again upon how much work has to be done on any given script, the actual work of just digging and finding the subtext is exactly the same, from a classic work to a contemporary work, a new play.
I might get in trouble here, but playwrights sometimes, forgive me, aren't the authority on what they write, in the same way when we describe a dream, we maybe aren't hearing what we're saying sometimes. Like, would you believe that a little bit? Do you know what I mean?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean,
of course they're the ultimate authority, but you know what I mean.
No,
There's parts
I
of it
have.
that are unconscious.
I write. You tend to write very much from dream and image, and in my case, anecdote and recollection, and not necessarily to having a sort of entire vision of a narrative. You might have a vision of a world, but that's not the same as having a sense of a narrative and what that entails.
Or just in that moment of auditions, I think actors, when it comes mirroring back to you, or when the director tells the story back to you, you do have revelations about, that's why I'm drawn to this, or that's what I was really saying.
But that's the great part of collaboration, where you have to be that open. I mean, you have to know where you feel when your play is working, when the music of it is working. You have to know what it is to protect. Because I think a new play, I mean, the play we're starting previews tonight is so new, that I don't have it clear in my head what you just said, and that's why the auditions were very powerful for me in trying to say, oh, this is what the
And then,
style
like,
of it has to be.
First preview is so much more terrifying than opening night because that audience is like telling you everything that you've forgotten during the rehearsal period, stuff that was funny first day and then hasn't been funny since. You know, stuff you thought was really serious turns out to be sort of funny, and or you want to get that under control or whatever. It's just so scary first preview. I think
don't
of
think
it
so.
shaking.
I
Yeah.
think no. I go on. I just shut everything off entirely, get through it, and move forward, knowing that it's going to take actors, for instance, at least 5 or 6 or 7 times in front of an audience before they even feel comfortable enough to communicate what they're doing. I write off entirely the first audience, and who would want to go to a first preview of something? You know, what kind of audience is it? It's a room full of sadists, generally, you know, for the most part.
It's your
You know,
fans.
judging
You get to
sadists.
play.
I'm very hostile to first audiences. Why are you there?
defense.
Well, what else is there to being a playwright but defense?
Yeah. Actually, I get so nervous that about 10 minutes before I just lose all sensation and I'm just nowhere, you know, barely there.
What's
Yeah.
your, sorry, what's your experience of that, Peter?
You know, I think it's a little of both what Mary and Robbie are saying. It's very, very terrifying for me. The first preview. I should be able to write it off, but it's hard for me. I do think though it's a sort of a next step. It's sort of a clean slate in the sense that I'm there to sort of listen to how they're responding, and that's a whole another thing, and it's up there, and it's no longer in here, but yet it's got to go back in there a little bit. So it's also athletic. You know, you think, oh God, how much am I going to have to?
I end up watching
Redo.
Dan usually because we usually do them together, and he knows I'm watching him, and his hand will just go up, and there'll be a little scissors motion. How does he know? It's just, you know, and also I'll spend the whole first week, and they'll just be, he's making a suit. You know.
But you also can't panic during previews and
No.
keep rocking the
Yeah.
boat every night. And so the actors always have new lines and then they never settle. You have to, because often, don't you find that there can be like something that seems like the most giant problem, but the actors eventually, organically, like the irritant of sand in an oyster, make a pearl out of it. You know what I mean? They just coat it, and they smooth the edges, and they make it work. You know. But if you rock that boat every day, giving them pages and pages, and in some kind of panic. It does take them days and days to get it in their bodies and make sense of it. Even though they're good at faking like that's true, but when they're faking it, it doesn't work. And then so you make more changes or whatever.
But in a way, though, your process from the beginning
That's
works
right.
on that
Yeah.
kind of times, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a little bit of get it done. There's if you've got 3 weeks and you're starting from
absolutely
nowhere,
right.
you've got a little
You're right.
panic going to begin
No,
with.
it's total panic, and it's a high wire act. You're right, and it's changing all the time. But on the other hand, it's not in front of an audience, and I'm not being judgmental with them. You know.
Gene,
Nobody said anything about the producers or the people who put the money in the show. And those are the dangerous people on that first preview. Because they, what did I say, John?
No, I'm sorry.
You've lost your audience.
Right back. Excuse me. All this talk about
You just
first
said producer,
all
Gene,
this
and
talk
he
about
left.
first
Yeah.
preview.
Right. I think it's the most, you know, for a commercial production, I think it's the most scary of ever. It's because, talk about watching the other faces. You see these people who have put their money in it, and if a laugh doesn't come, they'll laugh. They have terrible reactions, and you can't help but be influenced by it. We're patient. The directors, the actors, and the playwrights, but they're not, because they're civilians. And I wish there were a way to keep them out, but...
well, we'll try to solve that problem as we take a little bit of a pause so that Isabel Stevenson can tell us about the good works of the American Theater Wing.
Before we get back to the American Theatre Wing's seminars on working in the theatre, this one is on playwrights and directors. I'd like to remind you that these seminars are only one of many programs that the Wing undertakes. You are probably familiar with the American Theatre Wing's Tony Awards given for excellence in Broadway theatre. We also have a substantial grants and scholarships program providing aid to off and off Broadway theatres, as well as to promising students to pursue studies in the theatre arts. As a long-established charity, our other meaningful and thriving programs are designed to promote excellence in the craft of theatre and to introduce young people and their families to theatre and the magic it unfolds. Our hospital program, dating back to World War II, when we also created the legendary stage door canteens to entertain patients in hospitals, nursing homes, aid centers, and child care facilities. We take pride in the work we do and remain grateful to our members and everyone whose contributions help make possible the programs of the American Theatre Wing. Our work is so important to the theatre and the community, and we're proud to be a part of this exciting industry. Now, let's return to our panel on playwrights and directors and our moderator, Jeffrey Eric Jenkins. Jeffrey, would you like to start again?
Thank you, Isabel. When we left, we were talking just a bit. Gene Sachs had begun to talk about the role of producers in the collaborative process, if you will. We've talked about some of the collaborations between playwrights and directors. We've talked about some of the collaborations among the company. We'll return to some of that. But I thought we should return for a moment to talk about this relationship of the producers to the development of works in the commercial theater. Gene, what do you think is what is the drawback of the commercial producer? What is the advantage of the commercial producer? How does that relationship work?
Well, first of all, I wish we had a different word than collaborator. It always makes me think of the French and the Germans. And really, we're talking about people who help one another, not who kill one another. Although that's what producers and directors and actors often do. But you know, when I think about producers like David Merrick, there's a man who was a dirty rat. I'm sorry, he was a terrible man. He could do the worst things to you. You couldn't trust him for a minute, and he would get his way. And he would get his way because he was strong, acquisitive, and not stupid.
He'd been in a playwriting class with Tennessee Williams.
Yes. I wouldn't put it past him.
In St. Louis.
He was, but the collaboration and the talk about producers has to take into consideration who's the strongest personality, who's the one with a track record, who's the one who can get the money, who is the one who is just a domineering personality. And unfortunately, that often is the person who leads the artistic taste of the show.
Well, of course, that's changed a bit in recent years. We often talk about the loss of independent producers to the producing community as more and more we see corporate entities becoming the producing entities. I'm wondering, Dan, what has your experience been in dealing with, I'm reluctant to say collaborating, in dealing with producers in the artistic process and the creative process, bringing the work to the stage?
I don't know what it's like with you, Gene, but I found myself very often being a buffer between the producer and the writer, trying to find some way to keep the producer away from the writer, trying to find just sort of politically the way to navigate through the difficult periods of previews when, as you say, a producer will very often start to make egregious demands on the production.
No, I think that's true. And I think because you and I are both kind, normal.
Well, speak for yourself.
Wonderful people.
Yes.
And I've been a buffer many times in that situation. One play I did called Generation, in which Henry Fonda was the star. That's another thing we haven't talked about, is the star actor or actress, who is very important and has a great deal to say, whether they exercise it or not. The presence is great. But this was a first-time playwright. There was a strong producer who, Freddie Brisson, who was not a very good producer, I'm afraid, but he's dead now. I can say whatever I want. But he...
Tell his nickname.
The Lizard of Roz.
He was married to Rosalind Russell. The Lizard of Roz.
Married to Rosalind Russell, and he was called the Lizard of Roz. And he was, too. He was the son of Carl Brisson, the entertainer, a man who never got out of his tales.
You raise an interesting point about the actor, about the star actor, and I wanted to ask.
You're trying to get me back on track, aren't you?
Well, I
You'll
might
never do it.
You never hear enough about Carl Brisson. That's why we're all here.
But I wanted to ask Robbie about the experience.
Good luck,
because
team, but keep coming. Yeah.
Oh, let me finish the story. The story that I started. I just remembered that I had an ending. And there was a first-time playwright.
William Goodhart.
Yes, who is also now deceased. So we can talk about all these people. But Bill Goodhart had his own ideas since he wrote the play of what should be done. And one day it actually came to a fist fight between Freddie Brisson and Bill Goodhart.
Is that why he's dead?
No, I was like a referee, dancing between the two of them. Fonda was, Fonda said, that's the last time I will ever do a play with a new playwright. He was...
Who won the fight?
The playwright.
No, he didn't win. No, he was lucky. He had Fonda and me, because I think we helped this play a good deal. But we talked sensibly to him and kindly, and I think he profited by it. Whereas Brisson punched him in the nose. I mean, that's why I keep going back to personalities, and what a great part of our whole thing in collaboration is what kind of people we are and how good we are at psychiatry and morality.
Well, that's. I wanted Robbie to address that issue about working with star actors. Certainly in 10 Unknowns, you had Donald Sutherland and Juliana Margulies in marvelous roles. And what was that experience like? Certainly you had Dan Sullivan to work with them. But how does that experience work? Perhaps you could both address that issue of working with a star actor. Is there a sense that that they have more sway in the rehearsal room? How does that?
I think I don't think about their status that much. I think about their sanity a lot, and their general ability to kindly cooperate and to be part of a process, and their generosity. I don't have that much experience with stars, but the little experience I have with them is that they tend to not like to being treated like stars, and I think the more that's not a part of the equation, the better things are. That particular play was not made easier by some of the personality stuff, but I don't think that necessarily had anything to do with starness. I think it had to do with medication or something, or the lack thereof.
I think also, though, that if you're talking about film stars, they're very often so used to a way of working, which is they're really in control of what they're going to say, unfortunately, usually. So that very often when they come into the theater, they expect the same kind of input. And I've often found, again, just it's important to be able to listen. Very often the instinct is to say, well, I'm not going to be listening to this. I'm going to work the way I usually work. Sometimes you're working with very smart people, and the ideas are good. So you have to be able to balance your own vanity against what you can actually learn.
To me, it seems that the difference between working in films and working in the theater is that Alan Pakula told me that when he was making his picture, I forget the Devil's Own, and out of the trailer one day, Harrison Ford came and said, "These are the lines I'll be saying in this scene." And Brad Pitt came out of his trailer and said, "These are the lines I'll be saying in this scene." And his job was then to put their versions of the script, which featured both of them together. But it's about the play, and I think that I feel that we have to have a director who has a very strong rock at the center of it, who says this is the intention, and if the otherwise, if the star hijacks the show, then it's a bad star. Then it's something that's gone wrong from before production started.
Robbie and I were working on a show once where we were in previews out in L.A., and the star came in, very sweet woman, a movie star, and she had written an entire speech for herself.
Yeah, I still have it on my bulletin board. It was actually great, I have to say. It's on, Hotel de Cap stationery.
Would this be an Ibsen speech?
It was not. It was actually one of my own, and it was much better than mine. But it wasn't mine, and it went on. It was very long, and it involved several grudges and scores she was settling off stage. And but what did we do?
We just said, "Oh no, not possible." No. And she was, in that case, very sweet about it. She thought, "Oh, okay." I mean, she suddenly thought, "Oh, I mean, I can't do that." Oh, all right, I won't.
But in another instance with another. I guess the tactful thing is not to say the name ever.
But it sounds
I think I would know that. But the first day of rehearsal, Dan and I are sitting next to each other, and Dan's hand goes up like that.
Lies.
Little cut. So we sort of confer with each other, and a little two-line cut. And the nameless star put his head in his hands. I went, "Ugh, you've eviscerated me here." and that, you just know that you're in for such a terribly bumpy ride.
Well, Peter, you've got a big star in Q.E.D., Alan Alda, and how has that process unfolded? Now, you're also a television writer and producer with a number of credits to you.
Yeah, well, Q.E.D. actually, Alan was always involved with Q.E.D. He had an interest in finding a way to put the character of Richard Feynman on the stage. But I actually started out with, so it was a job to the extent that I met Alan and read the books, Feynman's books, and thought, I think there's a way maybe for me to make this work. I was intrigued enough to try it, but not at all in the form that it's in. And in fact, it went through many, many drafts that had many characters in it, many that were on the stage in the play. And Alan and I both, I think, sort of agreed from the beginning that that was the way it would be. And he's an actor who likes working with other actors and likes the give and take of that. And so, and I had no particular interest in writing what has almost become a one-person play. It literally astonished me how I could go through almost a kind of playwriting course of I mean, I could show drafts that are completely different drafts of what was on the way to being Q.E.D. And then as it became what it became, it got a little scary, because then it became clear to us that it was going to be him and me and Gordon Davidson, the director, in the room together pretty much the whole time, except for one scene where another character comes in. And then it then became about something else, because I very much wanted to make sure that that every moment was going to be right for the character and for Alan doing the character. So then the journey became even more rigorous in a way, once we determined that was the way that the play was going to go. So it's been remarkable with him, he was absolutely the other collaborator in that with myself and Gordon. And the second act of the play, we did beat by beat on its feet after I had a kind of version of it. And Alan, every moment needs to know exactly where we are, and we were sort of working through, almost graphing through the emotional. The life of the character. So for me, it was ultimately very exhilarating to work that way. But it certainly didn't start out. That wasn't the way we started out. To where
the
we
stars can be great. John Lithgow is an ideal person that you wanted. I mean, John Lithgow is a perfect actor. He behaves perfectly. He is. I mean, sometimes you need a star because they have an authority. They have a special quality and authority that makes them stars. But when you have somebody who has that quality, as John Lithgow does, yet still the modesty, and as Robbie said about actors just wanting to just get in a script and work on the script and work on the text and listen to the director and the playwright, and so it can be a remarkable, very, very invigorating experience.
Is there a time when those of you who are directing want the playwright to go away for a little while, and so you can work with the actors alone, or do you want that playwright in there all the time, feeding back in whatever way, and what kind of feedback do you want the playwright to give to the actors? So it's sort of a two-part thing. Dan?
I think the actor should, the writer should be able to be there whenever they want to be. Sometimes I wonder why they're there. Sometimes they'll just sort of...
It's more fun than any place else to be.
Yeah. I mean, I remember sometimes with Wendy Wasserstein, who will be in the room every minute of every rehearsal through text, never leaves the room. And that seems kind of punishing to me, in a way.
It's not. It's that it's rare. Yeah. It's that it's not the real world, which is so horrifying. It's that it's your world, and you can't get enough of it, really. And it's also tech is the only time I can sleep in my life ever.
But I also think the only times that I've ever wanted a writer not in the room is if there's too much writing going on and too much fixing going on at a time when you're really trying to get the thing on its feet and before an audience. Very often that will happen just as you're starting into previews in the text, when you see that the actors may be a little bit nervous and suddenly they've got new pages and could we just wait for a while before we do this? That will occasionally happen.
I had, with Neil Simon, very good experiences with that division of, what would you call it? He liked to watch the play from the standpoint of the writing, first of all, in that to see if the scene worked and in rehearsal. And he would say to me, I don't think that scene's working right. I said, I know, and I think I can make it work. He said, no, I watched it. It's not your problem. It's my problem. I haven't written this. I want to go, and he'd go out and to another room and write something. Come back in a very short time, usually, with something new, which would work. Not always, but most of the time he'd get his he'd find his way by listening to the rehearsals, and I didn't mind that at all. There were other things where he was entirely impatient about things. For instance, in Lost in Yonkers, which is a good example for many things, and I'll tell you, I'd stage a scene, and he liked it. He thought it was fine, and he went out of the room, and I said, I think she's being upstaged on this. I'd like to make a different arrangement. The whole cast was on stage. I'd like to arrange everybody differently. And so I was doing that, and I did a different version of it. He came back in the room, and I thought he was going to kill all of us. He said, it was fine, perfect. Why are you touching it? Why? Damn it! And he walked out of the room in complete anger. Okay, I'll put it back. Sorry, I lost my head for a minute.
I had an experience, just in terms of what that collaboration is, and I did one play with Neil Simon, and it was an example of how a director and a writer don't work well together, only because I spend maybe a week at the table to begin with, and we're doing a thing called London Suite, which are 4 short plays. So we start out, we finish the first day of reading, we come back, we start again talking about the subtext, etc. He gets up, he's walking around the room, very, very nervous. At a break, I finally go up to him and say, "What's wrong?" He says, "I can't work this. What? I can't work. You got to get it on its feet." And that was the time I asked the writer to leave. I said, "Okay, why don't you go away because I don't know how else to work. I have to sit here and figure this out. I can't stand up and start walking around unless people have some sense of who they are."
Did he ever ask you before how you work? I mean, it seems to be part of the things that you would happen to talk with.
No, we didn't talk about that. We should have. Yeah. But in fact, he did go away, and we did our work, and he came back, and we worked. But it was not from that time on. It was a little wonky.
I'm actually having sort of, in a way, my first collaboration in this sense, in that I'm doing an opera with Philip Glass. So he's composing the music, and I primarily did the libretto. And he's a perfect collaborator in my feeling, in that he's like, he'll make these little suggestions, but then he'll always say, "But you'll do something wonderful, you'll do something wonderful." And he's very passionate about it, and at the same time sort of hands-off about it. But I have had this weird experience where he was calling me, because he had me do the words first, and he wanted all the words before he started writing anything. And then he would call me like every morning at like 7:30, and he said, "Yes, Mary, there's a problem. There's some problems I want to go over. You have the word planet. Can we make it planets?" And then he would say, "You say night and day, night and day. Can we make that night and day, day and night?" And it's on that level, and this went on for weeks. And I was like, why is he calling me? And then I realized that he was being as respectful towards the words as if they were notes of his score. I finally sort of figured that out, and where I would never tell a musician, like, "Can we make this a different note?" He was treating the words the same way, but just that led me to all kinds of thoughts about there's a sort of a valuative difference between words and notes. A note is a note, and it can't be any other note, and you might say that about words, but these little changes meant nothing to me. And then he finally called me up and he said, "I have found a rather serious mistake in the libretto." And I was like, "Here we go. I'm going to have to cut a whole scene and rearrange it." And he said, "Sometimes you capitalize sun and moon, and sometimes you don't." That's like the
That's a
degree
big difference. I can imagine a composer responding to the importance. There's a difference between sun and sun.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
I suppose that's correct. But I was like, you know, can't I get back to sleep? I mean, like, we could change that down the road, and he had an urgency about all that, you know. But so far, he's been great, and it's because his visual sense, and I'll just say that, well, no, I can't. He has a very, 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 very large musical oral sense, and his visual sense is a little bit more, it's not as large. And some of his suggestions are a little, you know, they're a little odd. But he, just hands it over in this really beautiful way. And so, like, he's coming for the first, 4 days of rehearsal, and then for tech, weirdly enough, and previews, you know. But that's because that's when the orchestra comes, and he wants to hear the orchestra. Yeah.
John, so, excuse me, I just wanted to say something about the actor's contribution. I forgot who said this, but talking about good contributions that the actors have, good feelings about what should be and things that bother them, that they want to change. And often, depending on the person, of course, it was very helpful. When I did Lost in Yonkers, Mercedes Rule was worried about her part, to the point where it drove me crazy. But in the end, I found out she was right. There were things in the end that, in the end of the play, that had to be changed, should be changed, and I must say she got her point across, and Neil accepted that, Simon, and agreed. I mean, he didn't. He saw it with the changes in, and said, "Yes, you're right. It's better."
Unless I think I've found unless it's an issue of real vanity, which you can really tell pretty quickly, they're generally they're right usually.
Yes.
Well, they have to become the authority on the part, you know, because they're going to play it night after night, and you're not there, and they're the one who's, like, your concentration's a lot of places, but theirs is there, although hopefully theirs is on the story and not just their part.
I'm working with Donald Moffat right now in a play, and he just said, this beat gets in the way of my line, and he's been very, very right about making cuts that will allow him to, when I see the way he works, what he needs for the part, to remove these certain blocks.
But I feel like, sadly enough, our role as directors is to render ourselves obsolete. And at the very beginning, you're sitting amongst the actors. You have this physical proximity that's like this close, and then they start going up on stage, and you're sitting in a chair, but you sometimes leap up and go back. And then they're up on stage, and you're out in the house, and every now and then you go up to them, and then you leave the building, and they're just there, and you kind of your job is to not need to be there anymore, to be forgotten about in a way, and that's it.
What a sad story.
But then we reconstitute, another family right away. And I like the rehearsal process. I don't want to be an actor. I don't like the repetition of it. I just don't want to do that. I like being in the room and having things happen and being there at the invention of the
Have you ever
moment.
written a play on your own? Just written a play?
Sort of, very close to. It was still kind of based on something, but I guess all the words were mine. Yeah. It was based on the Pygmalion myth, actually, but yeah, it was just in school.
Yeah. Do you do much direction of other people's plays?
Very little, just Mr. Shakespeare, because that's always like you just learn. I know it sounds corny, but just by that proximity to that text, you learn a lot, even if it's sort of you can't articulate it. Just you always find out, like around the table with Shakespeare, like, oh, well, we'll cut this. Who needs this? And then you find out, oh, the reason this little servants or these lords are talking for 4 lines is because every actor is backstage changing for the giant ballroom entrance that's about to happen. And I always have a friend who says that he can just see these actors on stage, at the Globe going, Will, I can't make the change. I can't make the change. You have to write, so he's like, okay, here's some more jokes. You find out like how for the theater they are, and you learn a lot about like structure and just a whole lot of things. And I've done a couple other things, like I did a Tom Stoppard play, who I was always a huge fan of too.
I'm interested also in how playwrights develop, where they get their ideas. Robbie mentioned earlier something about dreams, and I'm wondering how your dreams come to the stage, how you dream your play.
Well, it's
essence,
not literally. I don't
course,
write from
of
like
course.
a dream journal or something like that. But maybe I should. Who knows? But I tend to work from anecdote and from memory a lot, and from about some time ago I was listening to a radio report about psychiatrists and how the American Psychiatric Association had a war with itself in the late 60s and early 70s, and there was a series of interviews with psychiatrists, and it seemed enormously theatrical, and it got me started writing something which in fact wasn't really about psychiatrists, but was about the thing they were arguing about, which is a definition of illness, a definition of how we pathologize people and what it means to be segregated against. So I think I'm struck very much by painters' work, and the stories that painters tell that somehow lead to larger questions. There are different kinds of writers, and it might be easier to be the kind that reads about how the code got broken, and then writes that play. But that's just that ain't me, and so I don't know.
Peter, Peter. How does what you imagine, how does what you dream, how does that come to the stage? What makes you think about these?
I also don't keep a dream journal. I think I do. I read a lot and absorb, I guess, and can be a pretty slow how it comes in. I never really thought about what areas, except that I know that history. Lately, science, separate from Q.E.D. I've been working for a number of years on and off on a play that I'd started before Q.E.D. that has history and a lot of science in it, and it may be that I'm trying to find something that I don't understand, that the process of writing is sort of trying to help me to understand, and it usually isn't until the end of a first draft, way later, that I will say, oh, well, I guess that's what this play is sort of about, and then the rewriting will be to help me to make that better towards what that is. But
for our students who want to follow in your footsteps, could I ask a quick question? Where did you come from to be a playwright? What came before?
I came from Los Angeles, and I didn't want to be a movie writer, but I was and all plays I think are self-portraits. So you have to have this temperament that is involved in portraiture, I think. Where am I now? How do I locate myself? I think that's almost what Peter is saying. But I don't know that there's school, though I think there is, and it's. I think the great thing about being a playwright is that it's not something that you need to ask permission to do. You need not train, and you don't have to ask other people. You almost it's entirely self-motivated. So that's where I come from.
Where did you come from?
I grew up in Douglaston, Queens, and my parents are still there. I go out there a lot. And I came into the city from when I was very young to go to plays and see plays, and I can remember those that were particularly extraordinary to me, that felt like they were life-changing. One of which was the original production of House of Blue Leaves, which, along with Joe Egg, was two great, extraordinary experiences for me.
Oh.
John, what do you have to say?
You just want to make. Writing is my job in the theater. I love working in the theater, and playwriting is my job in the theater. I like the WRIGHT, the fashion. I like to make something that connects to an audience. I like making a theatrical event. But if I couldn't write, I'd work in the theater. I don't know. I've sold orange juice. I've checked codes. I mean, I'm serious. But I love working in the theater. And that's my job, and just to keep.
I hate to interrupt you. This has been so wonderful listening to you. You share your knowledge so generously with us. But the time has come for me to say thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you.
And thank all of you for being so very kind and generous to the American Theater Wing. This has been one of the seminars on working in the theater, coming to you from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Thank you so much for being here.